She leaned in so close I could smell the whiskey on her breath, mixing with something sweeter underneath. Lavender, maybe, or whatever it was. Frontier women pressed into their hair to remind themselves they were still beautiful. Her lips were half an inch from mine. Her eyes were wide open and terrified and hungry all at once, the way a woman looks when she's crossed a line she can't uncross, and I was drunk enough that the world had soft edges and hard truths felt like something I could touch and survive. "If you want," I heard myself say, my voice low and steady in a way that surprised even me, "I'll take the lead." She froze. The lamplight trembled between us, and everything that had been building for 3 long weeks on that lonesome Kansas ranch came crashing down around us like a barn in a storm. I had not planned any of it. I never planned things. That's what happens when a man spends 10 years drifting from one county to the next with nothing heavier than his saddlebag and his conscience. I'd ridden into Hartwell County in the last week of October, the sky the color of cold iron, and the wind carrying the first real bite of what promised to be a brutal winter. My horse had thrown a shoe 2 miles east of the Pruitt homestead, and I'd been leading her along the dirt road when I first saw the smoke rising from the chimney and the pale orange glow of a lamp through a kitchen window. I hadn't eaten since morning. I was tired down to my bones, and I had nowhere to be, which is both the best and the worst thing a man can say about himself. Hank Pruitt came out to the fence before I even called out, the way ranchers do when they've learned to watch the horizon. He was a heavy man, thick through the chest and neck, with hands the size of shovels and a face weathered into something close to stone. He looked me over the way men out here look over strangers, measuring, suspicious, slow. I told him my horse had thrown a shoe and asked if I might use his forge to set it right. He said he didn't have a forge, but his neighbor, a half-mile north, did. Then he looked at the sky, and I looked at the sky, and we both understood that the half-mile north wasn't going to happen that afternoon. "You can sleep in the barn," he said. Not an offer, exactly. More like a man doing an obligation he didn't much enjoy. "My wife will bring you something to eat." That was the first time he mentioned her. Not by name. Just my wife, the way some men say the land or the cattle, a thing they own that has a function. Or her name was Clara. If you're enjoying this story, do me a favor and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you know. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I'll leave a heart on every single one. I didn't see her until after I'd settled my horse and had a look around the barn. It was a decent structure, solid timber, mostly dry, smelling of hay and old leather and the particular animal warmth of horses in close quarters. I'd made worse beds on the trail. I was pulling my saddlebag down when the barn door opened and she stepped in, carrying a tin plate covered with a cloth and a cup of something hot that steamed in the cold air. Clara Pruitt was 27 years old, though I didn't know her age then. I learned it later, the way you learn a woman's age when she trusts you enough to tell it, which means she's decided something about you. She had auburn hair, the deep red-brown color of good saddle leather in the sun, pinned up in the loose way frontier women wore it when they'd been working since dawn and hadn't had reason to think about it. Strands of it fell along her neck and jaw, and she didn't seem to mind. Her eyes were blue-gray, the color the sky goes just before a rain, and they were the kind of eyes that see more than they let on. She was slender, but not fragile. 5 years of ranch work had given her a quiet strength, the kind you notice in the way a woman lifts things and the way she walks across uneven ground without looking down. She set the plate and cup on the edge of a stall and looked at me the way a woman looks at a stranger when she's been mostly alone for a long time and has almost forgotten that strangers exist. "Much obliged, ma'am," I said. "It's just salt pork and beans," she said. "Nothing special. Smells like the finest thing I've eaten in a week." She almost smiled. Almost. There was something working against it behind her eyes, and she turned and left before it could get any further. I ate alone in the barn that night, listening to the wind pick up outside, and I told myself I'd be gone by morning. That was the first of 3 weeks. The storm came in that night like it had a grudge. By dawn, there were 6 inches of snow on the ground and more falling, and the road north was nothing but white silence. Where Hank Pruitt came to the barn before breakfast and told me, flat as a plank, that I'd be staying until the weather broke. He said it like it cost him something. I told him I'd work for my keep. He looked at my hands, then at my horse, then back at my face, and gave me a nod that was almost approval. I spent that first full day splitting wood. There was a pile of unsplit logs behind the barn that had been sitting since summer, and I worked through it until my shoulders ached and the stack beside the house was chest high. Clara brought me coffee mid-morning without being asked. She didn't stay to talk. She handed me the cup, looked at the pile I'd already split, and walked back to the house without a word. But there was something different in the way she moved, something that hadn't been there the night before. Hank was not a cruel man. I want to be clear about that, because this story could be told wrong. He was not cruel. He was something worse in a different way. He was absent, not physically. He was there every morning, every night, every meal. But he existed in the same house as Clara, the way 2 fence posts exist in the same field. Close, facing the same direction, but never touching. He talked about weather and cattle and what needed doing. He never once, in all the time I watched them together, said her name. He never looked at her the way she deserved to be looked at. And I don't think he knew it. That was the particular tragedy of Hank Pruitt. He wasn't doing anything wrong on purpose. He'd just stopped seeing her, and he'd stopped seeing her so long ago that he didn't remember what seeing her had ever felt like. So Clara bore it the way strong women bear things in the frontier, without complaint, without drama, with a kind of quiet endurance that could be mistaken for peace if you didn't look closely. But I looked closely. I had 3 weeks, and nothing much to do except work and watch. And I'm the kind of man who watches. By the end of the first week, she had stopped leaving so quickly when she brought me coffee. We talked about small things at first. The storm, the horses, whether the winter would hold long or break early. She had opinions about all of it, sharp, considered opinions, and she stated them with a directness that caught me off guard. Women out here were direct, I knew that. But Clara was direct the way a person is direct when they've spent years having no one worth talking to and have almost forgotten the pleasure of a real conversation. She was hungry for it. Not for me, specifically, not then, but for the exchange, for someone who listened and responded and asked questions back. I asked questions back. By the second week, she was staying for 20 minutes some mornings. Once, when Hank had ridden out to check the cattle in the east pasture, she stayed for an hour. We sat on opposite sides of the fence near the barn, her on an upturned crate, me leaning against the post, and she told me about where she'd grown up, a small town in Missouri that she'd left at 19 to marry Hank and come west. She said it without bitterness, just as fact. But facts can carry weight, and that one did. "You ever go back?" I asked. "Once," she said. 3 years after we came out here, for my mother's funeral." She paused. "Hank didn't come. Couldn't leave the cattle." I didn't say anything. Sometimes saying nothing is the most honest thing a man can do. She looked out at the white prairie. "I reckon you've seen a lot of country," she said, changing the subject the way people do when a thing is sitting too close. "More than's good for me," I said. She smiled then, a real one, the kind that reaches all the way up, and for just a moment she looked like a girl who had not yet learned to stop expecting things. It was the most devastating thing I'd seen in years. "My name is Wade Calloway. I was 36 years old that October, and I had been a drifter long enough that I'd stopped counting what I'd left behind. I was tall, 6'2", broad through the shoulders from years of rough work, dark brown hair that needed cutting, the kind of jaw that gets described as strong, and a man is handsome and stubborn when he isn't. My eyes are green, which people sometimes mention, as if they expected something else. I wore a worn canvas coat over a dark brown vest, trail clothes that had seen better days, and boots that had walked more miles than they were built for. I was not a dangerous man, but I had the look of one, and out on the frontier, that look is a kind of currency. I was not looking for anything when I rode into Hartwell County. I hadn't been looking for anything in a long time. Looking requires belief that something is out there, and I'd worn through that particular belief sometime around the age of 30. He's sitting alone by a fire on the Texas Panhandle with no company but my horse and a bottle of rye. But something had shifted in those 2 weeks at the Pruitt homestead, something slow and unwilled, the way a river shifts course not in a day, but over seasons, quiet and unstoppable. I was starting to look forward to mornings. That scared me more than anything I'd faced in a decade. The night it happened, the night Clara leaned in with whiskey on her breath and her eyes wide open with terror and hunger, was a Friday, the 19th day of my stay. Hank had ridden into town that afternoon for supplies, which he did once a week, and which always became an all-night affair at the saloon. Clara had never said a word about it. She just cooked his dinner anyway and left it on the stove and ate her own meal alone at the kitchen table. But that night, she didn't eat alone. I'm not sure how it started exactly. I think she knocked on the barn door and asked if I wanted supper inside since the cold had gotten worse, and I think I said yes because I was hungry and cold, and because I am, after all, only human. I think it was as simple as that, and I think we both knew that it was not simple at all. She had a bottle of whiskey on the table. She said it was left over from when Hank had entertained a business neighbor the previous spring. She poured 2 glasses without asking. I didn't object. We ate and talked, and somewhere in the talking, the whiskey got lower, and the night got darker, and the stove put out its heat, and the whole world shrank down to the size of that kitchen. She talked about what she wanted, not in the way of complaint, she was too proud for complaint, but in the way of confession, which is different. She said she had wanted to read more books, but there weren't enough books out here. She said she had wanted to see the ocean. She said she had wanted, and here she stopped and looked at her glass and turned it in her hands. She had wanted to feel, she said, like she was in the right place, like she'd chosen something right. The whiskey was in my blood by then, warm and generous, making the edges of the world softer and the center of it sharper. I looked at her across the table, and I could see every year that ranch had put on her, and every year it had failed to extinguish. She was still that girl from Missouri, the one who had expected things. She'd just been waiting for someone to notice. "Clara," I said. And that was all. Just her name. She looked up. And then she was leaning across the table, and her face was close to mine, and I could smell the whiskey and the lavender and the warmth of the stove on her skin. And her eyes were doing that thing, terrified and hungry, both at once. And her lips were a half-inch from mine, and the whole world was holding its breath. I don't know exactly why I said what I said. Maybe it was the whiskey. Maybe it was that I was tired of things happening to me instead of me choosing them. Maybe it was that she deserved to have someone take the weight of it, the terrible weight of wanting something she shouldn't want, and carry it with her instead of leaving her to hold it alone. "If you want," I said, my voice low and careful, "I'll take the lead." She froze. The lamplight trembled. And then Clara Pruitt leaned back in her chair, slow and deliberate, and put her hands flat on the table and looked at them for a long time. I waited. I was good at waiting. A man who's drifted for 10 years learns to wait without fidgeting, the way a hunting dog learns to hold still. "That's the problem," she finally said, and her voice was just barely above a whisper. "I do want, and I don't know what to do with that." I leaned back too. I picked up my glass and looked at what was left in it. "Wanting and doing are two different things," I said. "You get to keep the wanting. That's yours. Nobody can take that." She looked up at me then, and there was something raw and grateful in her face that made my chest ache in a way I hadn't felt since I was much younger, and still believed in things without evidence. "You're a strange man. Is Wade Calloway," she said. "Yes, ma'am," I agreed. "I've been told." We did not kiss that night. I want you to understand that. The moment passed, and we let it pass, and there was grief in that, and also something like honor. Though honor is a cold thing to hold on a winter night when the woman across the table is looking at you like that. I finished my whiskey and thanked her for the meal and went back to the barn, and I lay in the dark for a long time, listening to the wind and trying to figure out what kind of man I was. Before you read on, if this story is reaching something in you, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. Tell us in the comments what city you're watching from. I'll drop a heart on yours. The next morning was the hardest morning of my stay. Not because anything had happened, but because nothing had. And we both knew exactly how close nothing had been to something. Clara came to the barn with coffee as usual, but she handed it to me without meeting my eyes, and I took it without saying more than I had to. And we both pretended the night before was just a night. But it wasn't just a night. I spent the morning mending fence on the west side of the property, a job Hank had been putting off for weeks, and I worked hard enough to keep my mind from going where it wanted to go. The cold was a mercy, sharp and demanding, requiring a man's full attention just to function. I was grateful for it. Around midday, Hank came back from his overnight in town. He rode in on his gray horse, looking like a man who'd slept in a chair, which he probably had. And he dismounted without ceremony and handed his horse's reins to no one in particular and walked into the house. I watched from the fence. A few minutes later, I could hear their voices through the kitchen window. Not the words, just the sound. And Clara's voice had that particular flatness it got when she was keeping herself in check. And Hank's had the rough, unaware quality of a man who didn't notice the flatness. I went back to the fence. That afternoon, I nearly left. I'd fixed my horse's shoe, and the road had been passable for 3 days already, and I had absolutely no reason to still be at the Pruitt homestead except that I was. I saddled my horse and packed my saddlebag and led her out into the yard, and I stood there in the cold afternoon, holding her reins and looking at the house. Clara was visible through the kitchen window, moving behind the glass in her calico dress, hair pinned up, the lamplight warm around her. She didn't see me. She was just existing, the way she did every day, in that house on that prairie, being invisible to the one person who was supposed to see her. I unsaddled my horse and put her back in the barn. I reckon I've done smarter things in my life. I reckon I've done stupider ones too. But that was one of the most honest things I ever did. Acknowledging, in the cold late afternoon on a Kansas prairie, that I was not ready to stop seeing Clara Pruitt. The week that followed was a different kind of week. We were careful with each other in the way of two people who know a door has been opened and have agreed, without saying so, not to walk through it. But careful doesn't mean cold. And the conversations we had that week were the best ones of my stay. Longer, deeper, lit from somewhere underneath by what had almost happened and hadn't. She told me about her younger sister back in Missouri, who had married a teacher and had 3 children, and wrote letters every month that Clara answered every month and treasured in a box under the bed. She told me about the summer 2 years before, when the creek had flooded and the lower pasture had been underwater for 6 weeks, and she'd helped Hank move the cattle to high ground at 3 in the morning in the rain, and how afterward she'd felt something. Not happiness exactly, but aliveness. The particular aliveness of having done something real. She said she missed that feeling most of the time. I told her things I don't usually tell people. About the town in Colorado I'd left when I was 26, and the woman I'd left it for, or maybe because of. It was hard to say, even now, which was more honest. About my father, who had been a rancher and a hard man, the kind of hard that doesn't come from cruelty, but from a life that never gave him room to be soft. About the years I'd spent trying to decide what I wanted, and slowly realizing I'd spent so long drifting that wanting itself had gone quiet. "That sounds lonely," she said, and she didn't say it with pity, which would have made it unbearable. She said it with recognition. "It is," I said. She nodded. "So is this," she said, and she meant the ranch and the marriage and the empty evenings, and we both understood that we were talking about the same loneliness wearing different clothes. On the last day of October, yet Hank asked me at breakfast if I'd be riding out soon. Not unkind, just practical. The weather had been clear for a week, and the roads were passable, and I'd done everything on his property that needed doing. And a man who doesn't leave when there's no more reason to stay becomes a different kind of visitor. "Tomorrow morning," I said. Hank nodded and went back to his eggs. Clara was standing at the stove. She didn't turn around, but I saw her back go still for just a moment, just one breath, before she reached for the coffee pot. That last evening was the quietest of them all. Hank retired early. He always did after a long working day, and Clara and I sat at the kitchen table one more time. No whiskey this time, just coffee and the sound of the prairie wind outside and the stove clicking as it cooled. We talked for a long time, and we didn't talk about what was happening, because we both understood it well enough without talking about it. We talked about everything else, books she wanted to read, places I'd ridden through, the way the stars look different in different parts of the country, whether spring would come early or late. Easy, comfortable talk, the kind you have when the time is almost up and you want to make it last. At some point, the conversation stopped naturally, and we just sat there in the quiet, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that only happens between two people who have gotten somewhere real. "You're a good man, Wade," she said, just like that. Plainly. I looked at my coffee cup. "I don't know about that." "I do," she said, and she said it with certainty. So the way someone speaks who has thought something through and arrived at a conclusion they're willing to stand behind. I looked up at her. She was looking at me steadily, and her blue-gray eyes were serious and clear, and there was no hunger in them now. Just something quieter, something that looked like respect and gratitude, and a kind of sorrow all at once. "Clara," I said, because there was something I needed to say, and I didn't know how to say it yet. She shook her head just slightly. "You don't have to," she said. "I know." I nodded. and I believed her. I left the next morning before first light. My horse's shoes held firm on the frozen dirt road, and the sky was still dark and full of stars as I rode north toward the county road. I didn't look back for the first mile. When I finally did, just once, I'm over my shoulder. I could see the pale glow of a lamp in the Pruitt kitchen window against the dark, and I knew she was up already, starting her morning the way she started every morning, alone in her calico dress with her hair still down, moving through the hours of a day that didn't have enough in it. I turned back to the road. Some things don't resolve. That's one of the harder truths of this life. You ride into a place, and something happens that changes the shape of you. And then you ride out. And the change stays with you, but the place stays behind. And both of you carry what you carry on into whatever comes next. There's no clean ending to that. There's no resolution that gives it all back. But there is only the memory of a kitchen table and a lamplight, and a woman's voice saying you're a good man, like she'd earned the right to judge. I reckon she had. I rode north for 3 days, cold and clear, and at night I camped under skies so full of stars it was almost too much to look at. I thought about Clara every night, not with grief exactly, more with careful attention, like memorizing something before it fades. On the 4th day, I reached a town called Crestfield and slept in a real bed for the first time in 3 weeks. In the morning, I had coffee and listened to a small frontier town waking up, and I thought, this is my life, moving through places, touching the edges of other people's lives and riding on. It wasn't a sad thought, it was just true. But something had shifted in me, somewhere on that ranch. Oh, in those long conversations with a woman whose name her own husband couldn't be bothered to say. Something had gone from quiet to awake. I wouldn't call it hope. I'd been too long without it to trust it by that name. But it was something in the same family. A willingness. A reaching toward. I don't know what happened to Clara Pruitt after I left. I like to think spring came, and the prairie greened up, and something small and good found its way into her days. I like to think her sister wrote a letter that made her laugh out loud. I like to think she stood at her kitchen window on a clear morning and felt, if not what she'd always wanted, at least the possibility of it. The fact that it existed somewhere, that it was real, because it was real. Whatever happened in that kitchen, whatever almost happened and didn't, was real. It counted. A woman reminded me that I was still alive inside, and I hope I reminded her of the same. I moved differently after Kansas, a little less numb, a little more present. And sometimes, when I'd stop at a ranch and a woman would come to the door, I'd take my hat off and speak gently and look her in the eye. Not because of anything I expected, just because I'd learned, from 3 weeks on a lonesome spread with a woman named Clara, that the most important thing a man can do is simply, truly, see them. That's worth knowing, even if you carry it all the way to wherever you're going. If this story stayed with you, if it reached something, do me a favor before you go. Subscribe to the channel and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I read every single one, and I'll leave a heart on yours, or it means everything to know where these stories are landing. The prairie was pink with dawn when I finally turned south again, toward the territories, toward whatever came next. My horse moved easy, her breath making small clouds in the cold air. The road stretched ahead, long and empty, and full of everything it didn't yet contain. I pulled my coat collar up against the wind and rode on. Much obliged.